The microphone screeched against worn fingertips as a figure in a tattered army jacket stepped toward the wedding stage. Every conversation in the Richmond Country Club dining room died instantly. 200 guests, frozen mid-bite, champagne glasses suspended in air like crystal teardrops. This moment would shatter everything the Montgomery family believed about their patriarch's war record. The man's weathered face caught the late afternoon light streaming through tall windows. His jacket, olive drab and frayed at the cuffs, bore no visible rank or unit patches, just the ghost-white outline where a name tape once lived. Behind him, white linen tablecloths stretched across the reception hall like fresh snow, dotted with centerpieces of Virginia dogwood blossoms. The sweet scent of magnolia from the gardens outside, mixed with the sharp tang of expensive cologne and nervous perspiration. "Excuse me," he said into the microphone, his voice gravelly from decades of unfiltered cigarettes. "I'd like to say something about the groom's father." The bride's mother, Eleanor Montgomery, shot up from the head table. Her pearl necklace caught the light as she gestured frantically toward the club's security. But her son-in-law, James Peterson, raised his hand. The 24-year-old groom's face had gone pale beneath his summer tan. "Let him speak," James whispered. The stranger's eyes found James across the room. Something passed between them, a flicker of recognition that made the young groom's hands tremble against his new wife's white silk gloves. "My name is Eddie Kowalski," the man continued, his Polish accent faint but unmistakable. "And I served with Colonel William Peterson in Vietnam. Khe Sanh, 1968. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Colonel Peterson had died 3 years ago, taking his war stories to the grave. Or so everyone believed. But here stood a man who claimed to know the truth. James Peterson stepped forward, his dress blues pristine against the chaos building around him. "Sir, my father never mentioned—" "Your father," Eddie interrupted, "saved my life on February 21st, 1968, the day before he supposedly died in that helicopter crash." The microphone picked up the sharp intake of breath from Elizabeth Montgomery Peterson, the bride herself. Her hand flew to her throat, fingers whirring the delicate chain that held her grandmother's wedding ring. What none of them knew was that Eddie Kowalski had been searching for this family for 14 years, and the story he was about to tell would expose a lie that had shaped their entire lives. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. If this story has you hooked already, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Eddie Kowalski's fingers gripped the microphone stand like a lifeline. The silence in the Richmond Country Club had weight thick as Virginia humidity, pressing against eardrums and conscience alike. This wedding reception was about to become a courtroom where the dead would testify. The security guards flanked the stage now, their black suits incongruous against the pastel celebration. But James Peterson held up his hand again, his young face etched with something between terror and desperate hope. His new wife, Elizabeth, clutched his arm, her knuckles white against the navy fabric of his dress uniform. "Tell me about my father," James said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. Eddie's weathered hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket. The crowd tensed, some guests half rising from their chairs. But what emerged wasn't a weapon. It was a photograph, creased and faded, protected by a plastic sleeve that had seen better decades. February 20th, 1968. Firebase Alpha. Your father and I were pulling perimeter duty when Charlie hit us with everything they had. Eddie's voice gained strength with each word. Mortars, rockets, small arms fire that sounded like angry hornets in a tin can. The photograph passed from hand to hand at the head table. Eleanor Montgomery gasped when she saw 2 young soldiers, barely older than her new son-in-law, grinning at the camera. One wore lieutenant's bars, the other a specialist's insignia. "That's William," she whispered. "But he looks so young." Eddie finished. We all did. Your husband was 23 when this picture was taken, 6 hours before he saved my life. James studied the photograph with hungry eyes. His father had died when he was 10. A car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Norfolk. The only stories he'd known came from military commendations and his mother's careful memories. Stories of heroism, Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, but never stories about survival. Eddie continued, his voice painting pictures that no metal could capture. The shelling started at 0300 hours, blew apart our bunker like matchsticks. I was trapped under concrete and sandbags, bleeding from my ears, couldn't feel my legs. Your father came back for me. The crowd leaned forward despite themselves. Even the servers had stopped clearing plates. The medics said I was done for. Spinal compression, internal bleeding. But Willie, that's what we called him. Willie Peterson carried me 2 clicks through enemy territory to the dust-off zone. Took him 4 hours. I was unconscious most of it, but I remember him talking to me. Singing, actually. Elizabeth's grandmother, 90-year-old Rose Montgomery, spoke from her wheelchair at the family table. Willie always sang, even as a little boy. He sang Blue Eyes, Crying in the Rain, Eddie said softly, over and over. Kept me awake, kept me alive. Hope bloomed in broken hearts. But what Eddie Kowalski hadn't told them yet was why he'd waited 14 years to share this story. Why he'd tracked down this family through military records and private investigators. Why he'd chosen this moment, this sacred celebration, to reveal what Colonel William Peterson had really done in Vietnam. Eddie Kowalski's next words hit the reception like shrapnel from an old wound. The crystal chandelier overhead seemed to dim as he pulled a second item from his jacket. A military dog tag, dulled by time and worn smooth by nervous fingers. The truth about Colonel Peterson's death was about to surface after 14 years of carefully constructed lies. This belonged to your father, Eddie said, holding up the tag. But here's what the Army never told you, son. Willie Peterson didn't die in Vietnam. James Peterson's knees buckled. Elizabeth caught his arm, her wedding dress rustling like autumn leaves as she steadied him. The dog tag passed through trembling hands at the head table. Eleanor Montgomery read the inscription twice before the words registered. Peterson, William J. Oneg, Catholic. The dates stamped on the metal told a different story than the one carved into the headstone at Arlington National Cemetery. The helicopter crash was real, Eddie continued, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. But Willie wasn't on it. He was in a field hospital, recovering from the wounds he got carrying me to safety. The Army listed him as KIA because of a paperwork error. Said it was easier than correcting the records. James found his voice, raw with emotion. You're saying my father survived Vietnam? I'm saying your father came home. Changed his name to William Collins. Moved to Oregon. Worked as a forest ranger for 30 years. Eddie's eyes never left the young man's face. He had another family, James. A wife named Carol. 2 daughters. The photograph that Eleanor Montgomery still clutched showed 2 soldiers grinning at a camera. But now she saw what she'd missed before the second soldier's face. Weathered and aged, standing in the back of this very reception hall. Eddie Kowalski had been watching them for hours. You came to the wedding, Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustle of silk and the distant clink of abandoned champagne glasses. I came because Willie died last month. Heart attack. And his dying wish was that I find his first family. Tell them the truth about what happened. Eddie's hand shook as he reached into his jacket again. He wanted you to have this. A letter emerged, sealed in an envelope yellowed with age. The address, written in careful script, read, For James Peterson, my first son. James stepped forward on unsteady legs. The envelope felt substantial in his hands, weighted with years of unspoken love and impossible explanations. Behind him, 200 wedding guests sat frozen in their chairs, witnesses to a moment that would rewrite a family's entire history. "He never stopped thinking about you," Eddie said softly. Never stopped regretting that he couldn't come back to the life he'd left behind. But what none of them knew, what Eddie Kowalski had discovered only after Willie's funeral, was that the man they'd mourned as a war hero had been carrying a secret darker than his false death. The envelope crackled like autumn leaves as James Peterson's fingers worked the seal. 200 wedding guests leaned forward in their chairs, the collective intake of breath audible as parchment unfolded beneath trembling hands. What emerged would shatter everything the Peterson family believed about honor, duty, and the price of survival. The letter, written in careful block letters, bore the header, Oregon State Forestry Department, and a date from just 6 weeks ago. James read aloud, his voice gaining strength with each word. "My dear son, if you are reading this, then Eddie found you like I asked him to. I have carried this burden for 34 years, and I cannot take it to my grave without you knowing the truth about your father." Eleanor Montgomery gripped the edge of the head table, her knuckles white against the ivory linen. Behind her, the wedding photographer had stopped shooting, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck as he too became captivated by the unfolding drama. "The Army told you I died a hero. They gave your mother medals and folded flags and stories about courage under fire. But the real story is harder than that." James paused, his eyes scanning ahead before continuing. The next lines would change everything. "I did save Eddie's life, but I also deserted my post to do it. When I carried him through enemy territory, I was AWOL, a deserter. The helicopter that crashed was supposed to take me to a court-martial." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. James's dress uniform suddenly felt too tight, the weight of his father's medals now pinned to his own chest, pressing against his ribs like accusations. Eddie Kowalski stepped closer to the microphone. "The paperwork error wasn't an accident, son. Your father's commanding officer knew what Willie had done, knew he'd saved my life by breaking military law. So when that helicopter went down, he made a choice." "What kind of choice?" Elizabeth whispered. "He listed Willie as killed in action instead of court-martialed for desertion. Your father got a hero's death instead of a dishonorable discharge." James continued reading, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I couldn't come home to you and your mother carrying that secret. How could I look you in the eye knowing that my heroism was really just breaking every oath I'd sworn? So I took the new identity the Army offered, started over in Oregon, lived with the shame every day." The letter trembled in James's hands as he reached the final paragraph. "But I want you to know that not a single day passed without me thinking of you. I have newspaper clippings of your graduation from West Point, your commissioning ceremony, your promotion to first lieutenant. I am proud of the man you became, even though I couldn't be there to help you become him." Truth carries its own weight. What none of them could have predicted was that this revelation would expose an even deeper secret, one that had been hiding in plain sight among the wedding guests themselves. Colonel Marcus Webb rose from table 12 like a ghost, materializing from shadow. His weathered face, marked by decades of military bearing, carried the weight of secrets that had aged him beyond his 67 years. The commanding officer, who had falsified William Peterson's death records, had been sitting among the wedding guests all evening. Eleanor Montgomery's champagne glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Crystal fragments scattered like stars across polished oak, each shard reflecting the chandelier light in fractured rainbows. The sound echoed through the stunned silence like a gunshot. "Marcus?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You knew?" Webb straightened his shoulders, the gesture automatic, after 5 decades of military service. His dress uniform bore the ribbons of 3 wars, Korea, Vietnam, and the early years of the Cold War. But tonight, those decorations felt like accusations rather than honors. "I was Willie's CO at Firebase Alpha," Webb said, his voice carrying the same authority that had once commanded battalions. "I made the decision to list him as killed in action. James Peterson stepped toward his father's former commander, the letter still clutched in his trembling hands. "You've been at every family gathering for the past 15 years. You gave the eulogy at my commissioning ceremony. You called my father a hero." "Because he was," Webb replied simply, "but not for the reasons you thought." Eddie Kowalski watched this revelation unfold with the satisfaction of a man who had finally delivered a message 34 years in the making. He'd known Webb would be here tonight, had counted on it in fact. The wedding invitation list had been surprisingly easy to obtain for a man with Eddie's particular set of skills. "Tell them about Firebase Alpha," Eddie said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Tell them about the choice you had to make." Webb's composure cracked, revealing the weight he'd carried since 1968. "We lost 47 men that night. 47 good soldiers who followed orders and died for it. But Willie broke ranks to save Eddie's life. And that act of disobedience, that moment of human compassion, that's what made him the only real hero I knew in that godforsaken war." The wedding guests sat transfixed, their celebration transformed into something resembling a military tribunal. At table 7, a young girl, Elizabeth's 8-year-old niece, Sarah, watched the adults with wide eyes, her small hands clutching a doll dressed in miniature wedding attire. "So you covered it up," James said, understanding dawning in his voice. "I gave him a choice," Webb corrected. "Court-martial and disgrace, or a new identity and a clean slate. He chose to disappear rather than shame his family with the truth. But the truth has its own gravity." What none of them realized was that Webb's decision to attend this wedding wasn't coincidental. He'd been waiting 14 years for this moment for someone to expose the lie he'd helped create. Because buried in his own conscience was a secret that would make William Peterson's desertion seem like a minor infraction. Colonel Webb's confession hung in the air like gunpowder smoke as 8-year-old Sarah Montgomery slipped from her chair and walked toward the stage. Her white patent leather shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, each step echoing in the cathedral silence of 200 held breaths. This child would ask the question that every adult in the room was too afraid to voice. "Mr. Colonel," Sarah said, her voice clear and innocent as spring water, "if you knew the truth about James's daddy, why didn't you tell him before now?" Webb looked down at the little girl, her flower crown slightly askew, her wedding dress miniature but perfect. In her eyes, he saw the same trust that had once shone in young soldiers' faces before war taught them that trust could be a luxury they couldn't afford. Because sometimes, sweetheart, grown-ups make mistakes trying to protect people they love. But lying is wrong, Sarah said with the absolute moral clarity that only children possess. "My mama says lying always makes things worse." The truth of it struck Webb like a physical blow. 47 men had died at Firebase Alpha, and he'd spent 34 years convincing himself that protecting William Peterson's memory was somehow worth the deception that followed. Eddie Kowalski stepped down from the stage, his movements careful, but determined. "Tell them about the other men, Colonel. Tell them about the ones who didn't get new identities." Webb's facade cracked completely then. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of his dress uniform, ribbons and medals suddenly looking like grave markers rather than honors. "There were 3 other deserters that night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Men who broke ranks to help wounded comrades. Men who put human decency above military protocol." James Peterson's face had gone pale as Virginia moonlight. What happened to them? Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Prison time. Webb's words fell like hammer blows. "I could only save one man's reputation. I chose Willie because he'd saved the most lives. But the others?" Eleanor Montgomery stood on unsteady legs, her pearls catching the light as her chest rose and fell with rapid breathing. "You let me mourn a hero while other mothers mourned criminals? You let me build my life around a lie? I thought I was being merciful," Webb said. "You thought wrong," Eddie interrupted, his Polish accent thickening with emotion. Those other men deserved the same chance Willie got. They deserved clean slates and new beginnings. The wedding reception had transformed into something resembling a war crimes tribunal, but at its center stood a child whose innocence cut through decades of institutional corruption with surgical precision. Justice demands a reckoning. What would happen next would depend on whether the adults in this room had the courage to follow an 8-year-old girl's moral compass toward a truth that could destroy careers, friendships, and carefully constructed legacies. Sarah Montgomery's small hand slipped into Colonel Webb's weathered palm, her 8-year-old fingers impossibly gentle against skin that had signed death warrants and commendation letters with equal frequency. The gesture silenced 200 adults who had forgotten what moral courage looked like. The moment of truth had arrived, and it would be delivered by a child in patent leather shoes. "You can fix it," Sarah said, looking up at Webb with the kind of faith that adults spend lifetimes trying to recapture. "You can tell people the truth about the other soldiers. You can make it right." Webb knelt to Sarah's eye level, his dress uniform creaking with the movement. Behind him, the wedding reception had become something unprecedented, a sanctuary where decades-old wounds might finally heal. "It's not that simple, sweetheart. Those men are older now. Some might be alive," Eddie Kowalski interrupted, pulling a manila folder from his jacket. "All 3 of them. I found them the same way I found Willie, the same way I found all of you." The folder hit the head table with a sound like thunder. Inside were photographs, addresses, newspaper clippings spanning 34 years. Lives lived in shadow. Careers destroyed. Families torn apart by the weight of dishonor that should have been medals. James Peterson opened the folder with trembling hands. The first photograph showed a man roughly his father's age, wearing the uniform of a small-town police chief. The caption read, "Thomas Brennan, Medal of Valor recipient, Missoula Police Department." "He became a cop," James whispered. "After the dishonorable discharge, he became a hero anyway." The second photograph showed a man in mechanic's coveralls, surrounded by a family of 6 children. Robert Martinez, volunteer firefighter, saved 11 people from a tenement fire in 1979. The third photograph made Eleanor Montgomery gasp, an elderly man in a hospital, volunteer smock, reading to children in a cancer ward. David Sullivan, 23 years, volunteering at St. Mary's Children's Hospital. Eddie's voice carried across the hushed room like a prayer. They never stopped serving, never stopped trying to make up for a crime that was really an act of compassion. Webb stood slowly, his joints protesting after decades of carrying guilt like stones in his pockets. "What do you want me to do?" "Call the Pentagon," James said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Posthumous pardons for all 4 men, full military honors, recognition for what they really were, heroes who chose humanity over protocol." Sarah clapped her hands together, the sound sharp and joyful in the heavy silence. Like a fairy tale, where the good people win and the bad people say sorry. Love conquers institutional sin, but even as hope bloomed in that candlelit room, Eddie Kowalski held one final secret, a truth that would transform this story from a tale of military justice into something far more powerful and lasting. Eddie Kowalski reached into his jacket one final time, his weathered fingers closing around an object that had traveled from a Vietnamese battlefield to a Virginia wedding reception across 14 years of careful planning. When his hand emerged, it held a Purple Heart medal. Its ribbon faded, but its meaning eternal. This medal would complete a circle that began with gunfire and ended with grace. "Willie asked me to give this to you," Eddie said, placing the medal in James Peterson's palm. "But not the one they gave him for getting wounded. This one belonged to Thomas Brennan, the man who became a police chief after his dishonorable discharge." James stared at the medal, its weight substantial against his skin. How did my father get this? Brennan found Willie in Oregon 3 years ago. All 4 of the Firebase Alpha men had been looking for each other for decades. They became a family of sorts, brothers bound by the choice they'd made to save lives instead of follow orders. Eleanor Montgomery stepped forward, her earlier anger transformed into something approaching wonder. They stayed in touch every Christmas, every anniversary of Firebase Alpha. They called themselves the Deserters Club. Eddie's voice carried a note of pride. 4 men who chose compassion over compliance and spent their lives proving that heroes don't always wear the right uniform. Colonel Webb had been silent through this final revelation, but now he spoke with the weight of a man who had finally found his path to redemption. I'll make the calls tomorrow. Pentagon, Army Times, Congressional Medal of Honor Committee. These men will get the recognition they deserved 34 years ago. Sarah Montgomery tugged on Eddie's jacket sleeve, her flower crown still slightly askew, but her eyes bright with the kind of clarity that cuts through adult complexity. Are you going to stay for the cake? It's chocolate with strawberries. Eddie knelt to her level, his voice gentle as summer rain. I think I will, sweetheart. Your cousin James and I have a lot more stories to share. As the evening wound toward midnight, the Richmond Country Club bore witness to something unprecedented, a wedding reception that had become a healing ceremony. James and Elizabeth cut their cake with hands that trembled not from nervousness, but from the weight of newfound truth. Eddie Kowalski sat at the head table, no longer an uninvited stranger but family claimed and welcomed home. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah Montgomery stood on a chair and raised her juice glass in a toast to telling the truth, even when it's scary, and to soldiers who choose love. Heroes emerge from shadow. Outside, Virginia moonlight painted the country club gardens in silver, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed midnight, marking the end of one story and the beginning of another. They say Eddie Kowalski still attends military reunions across the country, carrying photographs and Purple Hearts and stories of men who chose humanity over orders, proving that some lies die hard, but truth lives forever. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that courage comes in all forms. Sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones history tries to forget.